if there's impunity, corruption will never end. When a leader is found out to be corrupt, there must be penalty. People must resign, people must go to jail. I always tell my friends who love China, I use China as an example of this and the other, won't be like the Chinese. And I'm like, why don't you also copy what they do about corruption? They put you before a firing squad and shoot you. So if you think you like the Chinese because the Chinese are successful, infrastructure, it's number 2 economy in the world, and yet, okay, fair and fine. But how is that handling corruption? What do you do in South Africa? You set up a zone of commission. You talk about it and no action. The Chinese take the guy, take the woman, and shoot them. A firing squad. I'm not proposing that. I'm simply saying that we must be able to make sure there's no impunity in our societies. The ANC, what does it do? There's Pala, the ANC MPs, they block so they're abusing democracy to protect their leader. As an example, you can't do that. Once you do that, corruption won't end. So we need to make sure we deal with this thing called impunity. We also have a value system that is supportive of transparency and democracy in our countries.
Thank you so much, Professor Mutambara. Lindiwe, back to you. Professor Mutambara just mentioned now China, of us importing values from China. So my question will be, are there political models from which you draw inspiration from? For example, what do you think of China's political model? Do you have elements? Do we have elements that we can borrow as Africa? What are those elements that we should also not import?
There are elements of the economy and development that we can borrow, but absolutely nothing we can borrow from either self-determination and governance or human rights, as far as I'm concerned. And I do find it distressing whenever we see these discussions in Africa about whether we must choose between development and freedom. We don't have to choose. In many cases, freedom brings development. And often when countries like China and Singapore are cited as examples, they're actually the exception, they're not the rule. So I think one of the problems we have is not democracy in and of itself, it's the people who occupy these positions. And often we have leaders who go through the motions of democracy, who go through the motions of elections, and then continue governing illegitimately, and then we turn around and we say, look at this democracy thing, it didn't work. So we need to have a guiding definition as Africans, not one that's defined by the United States or the UK. We've seen how they're managing democracy themselves, right? So we have to have a guiding definition of our own, both as Africans and as countries in the global majority. What's happening in India, what's happening in Indonesia, what's happening in Senegal, what's happening in Ghana, where we model democracy for ourselves. But the principle is self-determination, not international interference, not being governed by illegitimate elites who didn't have to seek power, not development that is decided on our behalf of our top inputs, but a governance that is centered on the people. And I think that's something we don't need to learn from China. There are plenty of examples on our own continent that we can learn from, and there are plenty of examples in other parts of the world that are not Europe and North America that we can learn from. But the data is clear in terms of human development, economic outcomes, every indicator you can think of. Democracy, and not democracy in a particular definition of democracy, but broad democratic principles of self-determination, accountability, judicial governance, free media, etc. Consequence management through transparency and accountability. All of these produce better social and economic outcomes than autocracy. And the reason is that autocracy depends on the who. In China, they have the Chinese Communist Party, which has a very rigorous system of determining how it governs, and is able to kind of skirt the line between being a centrist, authoritarian government, but that participates in the market internationally. That's an exception, it's not a rule. It's not something from which we should borrow. What we should be borrowing from are examples where, in the majority, we see that democratic governance, freedom, also brings with it good development outcomes.
I want to emphasize the topic on our terms. On our terms. So it means that we must define our political models on our terms. Mm-hmm. Look at our culture, look at our values, look at our own thought processes. Be creative as Africans and build our own political models. Yes, we can learn from America. Yes, we can learn from Europe. Yes, we learn from Singapore and China, but learn from ourselves as well. When we are done, we must have the Zimbabwean model, the Nigerian model, the African model, which is different from China, different from Singapore, but very African. But let us not reinvent the wheel. For example, the Chinese are a good example of technocratic capacity, meritocratic capacity. I said 7 out of 9 of that committee are engineers with photographic memory. Yeah. So what I'm saying is the African, in a way, can also learn from America, but from ourselves as well, and build our own uniquely South African political model, and uniquely African model for the country.
And we can teach. They can learn from us.
Oh, definitely.
This notion that we have to learn from some other, we have to be the leaders in this regard. We can teach.
I told you guys, it's really getting heated here. So, Professor Mutambara, back to you. Recently, we have seen economic superpowers, namely China and the US, take a more aggressive approach in their foreign policies with Africa. Which elements of leadership are most crucial to ensure that the continent is not shortchanged and that Africa is negotiating as an equal partner?
Confidence. You must be an African leader that says, what do I want as Africa? What I want for the continent. So when you engage with the Chinese, you must have a plan for yourselves. Don't just go with the Chinese. The Chinese are business people looking after their interests. What do you want as the Ghanaian leader? What do you want as the leader of Malawi? So the African leader must have a vision for Africa, must have the confidence to say to the Americans, I have this idea, I have this strategy, can we work together on my terms? So one of the major characteristics of the leader vis-a-vis China-America issue on Africa is the African who is very clear on what he wants. You work with the Chinese if the Chinese are doing what is in our interest. You work with the Americans if the Americans are in agreement aligned to our interests. The danger is we find people going to bed with the Chinese without an idea of what they want as Africans. The Chinese are here to take care of business. But if there's synergy, if there's alignment between what I want as an African and the Chinese, we will work together. If there's alignment between what I want as an African and what the Americans are trying to do, and we shouldn't choose between the two, we choose ourselves, like the Vice President told us this morning. At the end of the day, what do you want as an African? And who is serving your interests? And so we won't choose between the two, we'll choose ourselves. And then where we agree, we work together. And also, just to show you how flexible and how strong independent we should be. For example, the war in Iraq, in Ukraine. Why should Americans and Africans to support them without asking our own interests? In other words, the African must decide what position to take on Ukraine. Whether America agrees or not, we have agency as Africans. The same applies to the Chinese. We don't want the Chinese to be taking raw materials from Africa to China. If the Chinese are going to work with us in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, we must refine our minerals in Africa. We must produce catalytic converters with them together and sell to Europe refined products. Again, the African must be clear on what they want. And then you work with people with respect to what you want. So confidence and a Pan-African outlook. Oh yeah, Pan-African. We don't want China to be negotiating with Ghana. Exactly. No, we don't want that. We don't want China to negotiate with Malawi. No, we don't want that. Stop it, Malawi. We don't want South Africa to negotiate with China. You're too small, South Africa. Stop it, South Africa. We must be negotiating with China as SADC. That's volume. We must be negotiating with China as ECOWAS. That's volume. We must be negotiating with China as the East African Community. But more importantly, we must be engaging China as the African Union. 1.3 billion Africans. When we do that, we get a better deal. So we need to be approaching America, approaching Europe, and approaching China as one humongous economy of $3 trillion, $1.3 billion population.
Spot on.
Thank you. Lindiwe, you've been nodding.
We get summoned to these US Africa, UK Africa, Russia Africa, China Africa summits. But when we get there, we're broken up. And then bilaterals between Lesotho and China, and Malawi and China, and South Africa and China, and Swaziland, Eswatini and China take place. That's how you divide and conquer. A market that is big enough to be a compelling trade partner. But that's only going to happen if we can find ways to agree with one another about some basic principles and to make real the principles of free trade on the African continent that will empower us to negotiate as a bloc instead of negotiating as individual countries, some of which have only got 1 million people in them. And even those that have 100 or 150, still nothing in terms of size compared to the likes of the European Union, China, and even the United States. So what are we doing to make sure that the notion of a united Africa isn't just about shwe fabric and music and culture and unity and smiles? How is it hard economic policy making? How is it hard trade policy? How is it hard decision making about logistics? How are we making decisions? China's building trade routes throughout the world in a coordinated strategy from border to border. Do we have a similar strategy as Africans? How are we going to manage transnational trade? How are we going to manage transnational transport routes? We don't have any strategy in that respect, and that's why it's easy to pick us off one by one. And of course, when we are summoned to the UK, when we're summoned to China, we go. We don't say, actually, come here. We decided to meet in Addis Ababa as a bloc, and you are going to have to negotiate with us as a bloc. Instead, we go cap in hand, we shake hands, we hold guns, Kalashnikovs, in Sochi and Russia or whatever. We're grateful to be invited. And then we get, shunted into rooms where one country negotiates with the entire bloc instead of the other way around.
Well, we need to put people into this discussion. Black man, black woman, African, you are on your own. Europeans don't want Africans to be united. The Chinese don't want Africans to be united because they benefit more in the bilaterals. So we are on our own on the agenda of uniting Africa. The Americans, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese don't want the Africans to unite because they don't benefit that way. They benefit more in the bilaterals. So we must always remember that. Black man, black woman, African, you are on your own on the agenda of beneficiation. Do you think the Chinese would want you to refine your minerals in Africa, produce agricultural? They don't want that. They want you to sell it raw, and all of them want that. So we must always remember, that's why we need urgency and say, we are on our own, on our terms. There is no such thing as like a free lunch from these guys. We are on our own, but we can do it.
Thank you so much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from the horse's mouth. Now it's time to conquer the divide between the audience and our panelists. I can see hands coming up. So we'll have 10 minutes and we'll take 2 questions each, and then we'll have our panelists answer, and then we'll come again to another round. Maybe let's have this side, and then, yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Mutambara and Lindiwe. You've done a very good presentation just this year. My humble comment as African leadership is that we need leadership of the heart of the country, not the mind of the country. And I think that if you look at the room here, it's full of knowledge. It's time that young people also get into politics so that we can change the leadership mindset. African leadership is a struggle to get there. So when a leader becomes a president and he struggled, push money, and to get there, it becomes a challenge to change the mind, no matter how it is. So we need young people to strive to get into politics. So that when you look at the mind in Harvard here, and they get there, until then they can change the system. We need leaders with the heart of a country at heart to change it. African leaders have attended so many conferences, so many beautiful ideas, so many things. When they get to their country, they look the same. No change. They go to Canada, they go to America, they see it. When they come, the same. And so it has become quite difficult. And my humble support to this cause is that you need leaders with the heart of the country at heart that they want to do something. Until then, they become serious challenge. And I think the young people here that are coming to start moving into politics, because previously we thought that politics is for the elderly and the people who are fighters. Until you get there, Lindiwe, with your ideas, Professor, with your ideas, I'm just asking that. Can you demonstrate this boldness on a TV show in your country? You'll be there. And they'll call you to the presidency. Lindiwe, can you show this prominent and good speaking on the television? You can't. But you can show it here. One day get there so that you can change it. Thank you.
I can assure you I talk too much on television at home as well.
That's good. That's good.
Yes, please. You can keep it.
Thank you so much. I don't need a mic. I'll just amplify. I wanted to ask a question about the system. So you've spoken pretty decently, especially Ms. Lindiwe, on the nature of the system. Okay. So I was saying that you've spoken a lot on training leaders, and I feel like that's very important, and that I appreciate. But I wanted to ask a question using two examples. So I know the very recent presidential candidate who, Professor Mutambara, to your point about a president making their money first or so on, like he had his own, track record, he was campaigning and all of these things, and it seemed like he was gaining traction, but unfortunately he did not win the elections by virtue of a very perverted system. And there's also another example of a president who maybe started out very well. And I like the point you made, Ms. Lindiwe, about a president who is self-aware, or who is emotionally mature and all of these things. But the truth of the matter is that it seems like for most of the political leaders I've studied, some of them have the good mind and the will and all of these things, but they worked so hard and run so many times that by the time they got into power, they just owed so many people favors. And no matter where they turn, there is pressure on them. And then there's also sometimes the pressure to perform. Because it's a democracy, you have only 8 years. And in that time, even if you made promises, like you do want to honor the promises, but there are systemic problems that you should fix first. But if you do those, then there's no honor or glory or reputation that comes with doing that. So then there's just this pressure to, I promised I would do this, let me do it quickly, even if I'm not building a good foundation for my successor to come and build on. So can you please comment on the nature of the system and how even if you as a political leader are well positioned or you are well prepared for the task, the system might not support that?
That's such a great question. We say this a lot on our program. Democracy is expensive. It's not cheap. To run a campaign, to mount a media strategy, to traverse your country, talking to various constituencies, to support and pay, volunteers with the resources they need to go and speak out on your behalf, to buy social media advertising, television advertising, billboard advertising. If you are the most ethical candidate imaginable, democracy is still expensive. It costs money to reach people, to convince them to change hearts and minds. It's just the way of the thing. Now, in some countries, they're quite good at limiting that spending. They'll put limits on campaign spending, and they'll limit the length of the election campaign. And that way, everybody is sort of competing on an equal footing. In most of our countries in Africa, that's not actually the case. Campaigns are as long as they are here in the United States, and they're often as expensive. I know that the Kenyan presidential election that just took place, for example, ran into hundreds of millions of dollars per candidate, right? So, until and unless we accept that there are crooked people willing to pay the price to get who they want in office, and that unless we are willing to match that price by getting good people in office, we're just going to be sitting at the behest of exactly those interests you speak about. So when President Zuma was still in office, he signed a nuclear deal with President Vladimir Putin in Russia with trillions of rands that we could not afford and we had no hope of ever paying back. And it was a cash cow for the Russians. They were very excited about it, to build nuclear power plants, even though we have other sources of power, particularly naturally occurring in South Africa. It is said that the Russians under Putin had a list of successor presidents to follow Jacob Zuma after he left office, because in South Africa we have 2-term limits. And they were ready and waiting to fund those campaigns for those rogue individuals to get into office, to keep this lifetime contract going, so that they could keep shunting African money into their coffers. This is the meticulousness of the planning that goes on in the minds of foreign actors, foreign governments, foreign interests, and nefarious interests in figuring out how to buy their way into power, buy their way into access. So until and unless the good people, the entrepreneurs, the foundations, the pro-democracy institutions and organizations in our countries realize that the only way to deal with this is to back both, morally and also financially by helping them fundraise the right candidates to get into office. We're not only going to get nefarious leaders, but we're going to get good leaders who can't get funding anywhere else except from people who want quid pro quo. I've been into fundraising meetings where people said, okay, yeah, you can, yes, absolutely, we will write a check for the party. Can you get me a meeting with the mayor of Cape Town, though? We've got a contract that we need to talk about. I can't do that. That's unethical. But now we've got a campaign to run. There are people who are perfectly happy to cross that line. And it starts there and it goes all the way to full-scale manipulation. So yes, when you are a candidate, however ethical you are, you operate in this dangerous territory where, because you need resources to do what you need to do to get into office, and these are not resources to buy yourself a house or a car. This is to get elected and be an ethical leader in office and implement a change agenda. Because you have all these debts that you accumulate, sometimes those debtors come back and they say, remember how I got you elected? Let's talk about that contract for this and that thing in the city of wherever, right? So it takes a lot to get into office, and the best bet we have for having quality ethical leaders is having people like us who are willing to donate to the right candidates. Crowdfunding is a big part of politics these days, but also to have wealthy individuals, companies, foundations, institutions that are willing openly to take a bet on the best of the best, the most ethical, the most accountable, the most decent individuals to get into public office. Because I guarantee you, on the other side of the equation, there are nefarious interests waiting to make those transfers into bank accounts to make sure that their candidate gets into office so they can keep nuclear contracts and goodness knows what else running forever. So my advice to our fellows is you can always give money back and you can always say no. Right? People often end up in situations where they accept a check, for $500 million, whatever, from a donor, and they use it perfectly ethically in their campaign, and it later emerges that that person is a thief, or that they're racist, or whatever. You must get that money back. You must give it back. You needn't be associated with somebody just because in the past you made an ill-informed decision. But when you're giving that money back, somebody has to come in and back your campaign, because eventually you're going to need the resources to get past the ballot. So we've got two tasks. One is to clean up the money in politics by reducing the unit costs for getting into office, like some democracies have successfully done. The other is good people with resources need to step up and help young candidates, technically competent candidates, experienced candidates, get into office and implement the agenda that they want to, not the agenda that their funders want to.
Okay, I'll respond to the question about the leaders. Leadership does not exist in a vacuum. So in addition to growing leaders, breeding leaders, we must also develop value systems. We must also develop systems. We must also build institutions. So we should never depend on personalities, great leaders, so we depend on this. No, we must depend on institutions. We must depend on value systems. We must depend on the societal value system, so that when the leader misbehaves because they're in office, you take them out. That's why sometimes term limits are a good idea. No matter how good you are in the US system, after 8 years you're out. No matter how great a president you were, the system says 8 years you're out. By doing that, they're protecting their society from this great leader who is so electable, but might end up being a curse to the society. So, in addition to growing good leaders, breeding good leaders, we must also build our constitutional framework. What does the Constitution say? Term limits. Already you're protecting society from the demagogue, the electable demagogue. We are creating a system of law where you punish offenders. So, yes to building leaders, but but also institutions, value systems, and systems. Now, in terms of the leader who is creative and spend his own money, I think you're referring to Peter Obi. But the problem is you forgot about the traditional things. In addition to being a rock star candidate with new ideas and great leadership, you must build structures. Yet no structures. Where is your political structure framework? Who are your colleagues? Where is your leadership? So, in other words, we need leaders who have values, who are self-aware, who self-lead, and so on. But there's some traditional things you need to do. You need to build a political organization. You know, because if you have no organization, you can't crack it. So some of these superstars, great leaders, they must be helped by getting advice on building an organization so that you can field candidates across the country, councillors, members of parliament, senators, governors, and so on. It needs more than one individual. You need an organization so that you are able to carry it all through. Now, talk about, he's gone, I don't know where the gentleman is. We don't change our language because we're at Harvard. I speak the way I'm doing in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Africa. We take no prisoners. We are examples. I've been in government, I've been a deputy prime minister, running a country well. I'm not sure about what's happening right now, but when I was running the country, I'm sure the minister will tell us, but when I was running the country in Zimbabwe, we were doing pretty well. And so
yes, thank you, Professor Mutambara. I see I'm going to keep to my promises. Sorry to the organizers, but I want to be a leader who keeps their promises. So can we have the last two questions aside so that I think we have a lot of people who've got a lot of things to say. So let's hear that.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Michael Masia. I could have, prior to your panel discussion, I would have said I'm from Malawi, but I'll say I'm from Africa.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Went very well. And I have a question regarding this topic. Even you've mentioned several times, both of you, our terms. Like, how do we strike a balance between setting our terms and like the financial resources? Because there's an adage that goes like, beggars are not choosers. And even you mentioned, both of you, like, about negotiating at a regional scale, negotiating at a continental level as AU. But the African Union office was built by China. The headquarters was built by China, where the AU sits right now. And how can they negotiate on their own terms with China? When China will say, we'll bring a caterpillar and wipe away the office. So these are like, we have seen in a continent, like leaders who have been punished for their own terms, like Mugabe trying to defend their own terms, they will deny aid, and the people suffer, and the economic consequences, and people are angry with their leaders. So what is this? Anyway, to cut it short, how do we balance this fact that Africa needs resources, but also to strike with the terms that we may have? Thank you.
We'll have our last question now.
So, first of all, I apologize on behalf of all Ghanaians for not trumpeting Kwame Nkrumah. We did mention his name, but we didn't trumpet it. I have a question about leadership, African leadership, and our topic is the kind of leadership Africa needs. For me, I see Kwame Nkrumah the way maybe the French would see Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a different era, a different regime. I wasn't born. In my generation, I think of Muammar Gaddafi, just because of what I heard about him growing up. You also never mentioned his name. The same way you scolded us for not mentioning Kwame Nkrumah. And if you talk about Africa today and the unity of Africa, I think for most people in this room, he becomes more relevant. What do you think of him? And do you think he's the leader or the kind of leadership that Africa needs today?
Thank you for those questions. As we answer these questions, I will ask my panelists to also include their closing remarks. we are way out of time. So if you can just answer to the questions and also include your closing remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, you asked such a great question about the AU headquarters, which apparently are liberally bugged as well. So our conversations are listened to as well. So we can't even negotiate in good faith because they know what we're going to say before we get there. Right? It's a problem. And this is how divide and conquer works. You give little trinkets to people and then they become dependent on you without realizing that on the soil where they live are resources far beyond the imagining of these little trinkets that they're being given, right? So, and that's what happens when we're divided and conquered. We can't have a common strategy because we are more interested in short-term gains, you know, that quick loan from the China Development Bank in exchange for the national airport system, you know, than we are in the long-term strategy of making sure that we are a compelling negotiating partner for any in regional bloc or country of enormous power and wealth that we want to engage with. So at the moment, you may have read about how the Malians kicked the French out of Mali, the French military, only to bring in a private Russian contractor to replace them. A private Russian contractor that is active in every single region on the continent. They're in SADC, they're in East Africa, they're in ECOWAS. And that is another example of divide and conquer. The reason I bring up these examples is that what you're describing is a leadership problem. Individual leaders can only be siphoned off and controlled if they don't have the foresight, the integrity, the intellect, the ability, the high self-esteem to recognize that there's a bigger picture for which they should be fighting. And when they get these kinds of approaches to say, guys, can we actually hold back for a little bit longer and do better for ourselves and for our people than we are if we just accept this little trinket now? So I think better leaders would have said, thanks, China, we really appreciate your offer to build this for us. Why don't we borrow at a favorable interest rate instead and build our own headquarters? And no, we won't need your labor or your materials. We will source those ourselves and our security agencies will vet them themselves because we've built a regime in which we can trust one another to do these things across borders. We don't need you to do that for us. And we'll also pay back that loan because we are rich with natural resources and we have a strategy for organizing trade around those natural resources and not enabling countries to come in, build mines, and then fly private jets out without any customs clearance in order to make money for themselves and not for the people. So this is all about leadership. There are leaders who are for sale for a house in the south of France. You know, Paul Biya lives in a hotel in Geneva, right? That's not leadership. And until and unless we recognize that leadership is that binding constraint, that there are people who are willing, and I live in a country where that happened, who are willing to sell your country to a family from Gujarat in India for, you know, a chappies and a bottle of beer or whatever, a very small sum of money, because their personal financial interests are more important than the national interest, or because their re-electability by building something that seems productive but is actually not really, is more important than the regional and the continental interest. Until and unless we can elect leaders who can do that kind of thinking, be strategic. I mention high self-esteem because one of the things I often hear from fellow African political leaders is, you know, we're tired of these Europeans, they talk down to us. The Chinese, they always say, you know, we're a sovereign nation. We're not here, you're a sovereign nation. We're not here to tell you what to do. We're just here to do business. So they bring their low self-esteem issues, their history in the liberation struggle and the struggle against colonialism, and they allow it to cloud their ability to make clear decisions about what is actually in the best interest of the country. You're seduced by somebody who says, I see you as an equal. Can Lesotho really be the equal of China? No, come on. So what does Lesotho need? It needs to power up with the rest of the region and become a compelling, negotiating partner. So self-esteem is also part of these things. But I think, in true game theory style, there's a critical mass. We elect a critical mass of leaders across the regions in our continent who can make critical mass decisions at the regional level, then at the continental level. And we will no longer be a soft target for either France or Russia or China or any country to come and try and play like puppeteer with our political leaders. That's the challenge we're up against.
Thank you, Lindiwe. Professor Mutambara?
Ghana You made the wrong reference to Ghana, to Nkrumah. You talk about the dam. That's a national project. We're talking about Nkrumah as a Pan-Africanist. I was listening very carefully to your presentation. Our first president put up a dam. Wrong reference to Nkrumah. Wrong reference to Nkrumah. We want the Nkrumah who was a Pan-Africanist was talking about Africa. But then I appreciate it.
Ghanaians are modest.
Yes. Now, what they said also, okay, sorry. Gaddafi, lots of stories of Gaddafi, but you can't put Gaddafi in the same school or same class as Nkrumah. We respect Gaddafi, he's talk about the United States of Africa, his oil and so on. We respect him. But Nkrumah is in a class of his own. Okay? But we respect Gaddafi, and also the Africans sold him out. You know, the Africans voted at the UN to get him killed. Poor Africans, foolish Africans. They actually went along with the killing of Gaddafi. Shame on us as Africans. Now, beggars. We're not beggars, that's the starting point. Beggars are no choosers. Who told you you're a beggar? We're not a beggar. I'll demonstrate to you. If we're to have a diamond cluster, Botswana, Angola, South Africa, Zimbabwe, DRC, a diamond cluster working together, will dominate the whole market of diamonds. Will tell the price and say the price of diamonds.
And we control supply.
So if we're to do the diamond cluster, platinum cluster, Zimbabwe, South Africa, just the two of us, we control 90% of all platinum. We'll go to West Africa, oil cluster, Nigeria, Niger, and so on. So in other words, when we unite, when we work together, we won't be beggars. In other words, we'll be able to negotiate, we'll be able to work on our terms because of the scale. The Chinese, the Americans, and the Europeans work with us not out of love, out of economics. So yes, you always balance geopolitics and so on, but when you are strong as a market, as a source of capital and source of natural resources, you bargain better. Of course, you have to balance and negotiate with others. But when you go as a small country, as a small economy, you get short-changed. But as ECOWAS, as SADC, as East Africa, as the African continent, you have more bargaining power, and you can make a better difference that way. As we're concluding, because we want us to conclude, let me put it this way. Most of you are going to be superstar economists, superstar bankers, consultants. You'll never be respected as an African until the African continent is done well as a continent. So take it personally. Whether you're a professor at Harvard, whether you're working for McKinsey, whether you're working for GM, they will see the African and say, how is Ghana doing? How is Malawi doing? I used to go to the economic forum and speak, and they say, oh yeah, you're speaking very well. Where are you from? Then I refuse to say. I say, I'm coming out of MIT, I'm coming out of... We know that. Which country are you from? Then eventually I say Zimbabwe, they're like, oh, come on. If you're that smart, how come your country's messed up? If you're that, how come you could tolerate your own country? Shame on you, Mutambara, you are no rock star. So you will never be respected as an African unless Africa is done well as a continent. You can't be a rock star. So I'm saying this to say, no matter what you do in your life, please have Africa on your mind. Do whatever you can, wherever you are, to develop Africa, to provide leadership for the continent. Because your personal brand is a function of the African brand.
Thank you, Professor Mutambara. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it from the horse's mouth. Take it personal. Let's live as a united Africa. Let's conquer the divide. Thank you to my esteemed panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.